The room had no window facing the garden. It had one narrow cot, a basin for washing, and a door that locked from the outside. It was the kind of room that told you exactly what you were, not in words, but in square footage. And the woman who slept in it every night understood the message perfectly. She moved through the grand corridors of that house like a shadow, present, necessary, and entirely invisible to the people whose comfort depended on her. That is what the world had decided she was worth. And here is the thing about a world that decides your worth before you open your mouth. It is not shy about it. The social order she was born into was not a suggestion. It was architecture. Every law, every custom, every unspoken rule about who sat at which table and who cleared it afterward had been constructed over centuries with one purpose: to make sure that people born in certain rooms stayed in certain rooms. The hierarchy was not cruel by accident. It was designed. To understand her story, you need to understand that design. You need to feel the weight of it, because the more clearly you see the walls that surrounded her, the more extraordinary it becomes that she ever left the room at the end of the hall at all. That question, how she did it, is the only question worth asking. But it will have to wait. First, you need to understand exactly what she was up against. She was not born into poverty in the abstract sense that we sometimes romanticize in stories. This was not the noble struggle of a farmer's daughter dreaming beneath open skies. The world she inhabited was a closed system, and closed systems have a particular cruelty. They do not ignore you. They see you clearly. They categorize you, assign you a function, and then enforce that function with the full weight of social expectation, economic dependency, and legal invisibility. A woman in her position could not own property. She could not enter into contracts. Her name appeared in documents only when someone else required her labor. She was a supporting character in a story the world had already written without her. Can you imagine that for a second? Not being poor in a world indifferent to your ambition, but being poor in a world actively organized to prevent it. Every door she walked through belonged to someone else. Every fire she lit warmed someone else's hands. Every morning she rose before the household stirred, she was reminded, quietly, structurally, without a single word spoken, that her role was service, and her horizon was the edge of someone else's estate. That was the room she was given, not just the physical one, the entire concept of what her life was allowed to become. And yet, she was not broken by it. This is the part that the ledgers and the household accounts and the silence of official records cannot explain. Because the silence itself is evidence of something. People who are truly crushed by a system do not leave traces that force historians to ask questions centuries later. They disappear completely. She did not disappear. Something in her refused the room she was assigned, not with rage, not with rebellion, but with something quieter and far more durable. A quality of attention, a way of seeing the world that the world itself had not accounted for. What was it that set her apart? That is the question at the center of this story. Not her beauty. History is full of beautiful women who died in servants' rooms. Not her luck. Luck is a word we use when we cannot explain a pattern we haven't studied closely enough. Something else. Something that lived behind her eyes when she moved through those corridors, watching, listening, understanding the architecture of power from the inside out. We will get to that. But first, you need to feel the full gravity of the starting point. Because that is what this story is really about. Not the ending, though the ending is remarkable. Not the man who would eventually give her his name and everything that came with it, though that moment will stop you cold when we get there. This story is about the distance between that narrow cot with no window facing the garden and the life that followed. It is about what it takes to cross that distance. It is about the fact that someone did cross it, from a position most of us will never inhabit, in a world far more hostile than the one you woke up in this morning. She was given the servants' room. She was told, in every language a society knows how to speak without speaking, that this was her ceiling. And somewhere in the quiet of that room, in the hours before the household stirred, in the small space between one duty and the next, she decided that the ceiling was not hers to accept. That decision did not make her a legend overnight. It did not open doors or rewrite laws or change the mind of a single person who had already decided what she was. But it was the first move, And in games where the board is rigged against you, the first move is everything. There is a particular kind of violence that leaves no bruises. It does not announce itself with a raised voice or a slammed door. It operates through paperwork, through custom, through the quiet consensus of an entire society that has agreed, without ever holding a vote, on exactly how much certain people are worth. That was the world she was born into, and it had opinions about her that it had been refining for centuries. The legal architecture surrounding a woman of her station in that era was not ambiguous. It was precise. A servant woman without family connections of consequence could not inherit. She could not bring legal action in her own name in most circumstances. She could not negotiate the terms of her own employment without the mediation of a male relative or a household authority above her. Her labor had a price. Her person did not. The distinction between those two things, between what you produce and what you are, is one that the powerful have always been careful to maintain, because the moment the people at the bottom start confusing the two, the entire structure gets complicated. And it was not only the law. Laws can be changed, circumvented, occasionally ignored by people clever enough to find the gaps. What is harder to fight than law is culture, the invisible agreement between people about what is normal, what is natural, what is simply the way things are. The culture she inhabited told her story before she could tell it herself. A woman in service was expected to be grateful for stability, careful in her speech, modest in her ambitions, invisible in her opinions. Ambition in a woman of her position was not admired. It was suspicious. It made people uncomfortable in the particular way that only a mirror can make you uncomfortable. The households she moved through were not exceptional in their cruelty. That is almost the point. They were ordinary. The family that employed her did not think of themselves as oppressors. They thought of themselves as providers, generous ones probably, by the standards of their time. They gave her the room at the end of the hall, and that was considered adequate. They gave her meals and a wage and the protection of their roof, and in exchange, she gave them her hours, her labor, and the careful invisibility that the role required. This was the transaction. Everyone understood it. No one questioned it, because the system worked exactly as designed. Can you see how suffocating that is? Not the cruelty of exceptional evil, but the comfort of ordinary injustice, the kind that does not even need to defend itself because it has never been seriously challenged by anyone within reach. The people who benefit from a rigged system rarely experience it as rigged. They experience it as correct. And when you are surrounded by people who experience your cage as correct, the cage becomes almost invisible. That is the deepest function of a social hierarchy, not to lock the door, but to convince the people inside that there is no door. She was not the only woman in her position. That is worth saying clearly. There were thousands of women living versions of her life at the same moment in history, same narrow cots, same pre-dawn fires, same careful invisibility. Most of them lived and died in exactly the rooms they had been assigned, not because they lacked intelligence or dignity or the capacity to want more, but because wanting more, in a world organized against it, is extraordinarily expensive. It costs you the security you have. It costs you the approval of everyone around you. It costs you the comfortable numbness of accepting the story you have been given. Most people, in most eras, cannot afford that price. But here is what makes her story different. It was not that she was angrier than the others, or luckier, or born under a more favorable arrangement of stars. It was something structural, something in the way she processed the world around her that turned the very mechanisms of her oppression into a kind of education. While other women in her position looked at the grand rooms of the house and saw spaces they were not permitted to enter, she looked at those same rooms and studied them. She learned the language of power by watching it operate up close, every single day, from a position that powerful people forgot was occupied by someone paying close attention. That quality of attention is the thing worth holding on to. The world had told her, in every structural and cultural language available to it, exactly what she was worth. It had handed her an assessment and expected her to accept it. Most people accept the assessment. The cost of refusing it is real, and the outcome is uncertain. And certainty, even terrible certainty, is easier to live inside than doubt. She refused the assessment anyway. Not loudly, not with a manifesto or a declaration, but the way water refuses a dam, quietly, persistently, finding every small gap and moving through it. And the world, which had been so confident in its verdict, had not accounted for that. But that question, what she did with that attention, and where it led her, will have to wait. First, you need to understand the one thing she carried that no household inventory could ever list. There is a skill that does not appear on any list of servants' duties. It is not taught in any formal setting, cannot be inherited, and does not require a single coin to develop. It is the ability to read a room, not in the casual sense of detecting a mood, but in the deeper, more dangerous sense of understanding exactly what every person in that room needs, fears, wants to be seen as, and is terrified of losing. Most people go their entire lives without developing this skill at any serious depth. She had been practicing it since the moment she first carried a tray through a door that was not hers to open. Think about what her position actually gave her, beneath all the obvious indignities. She was invisible to the people she served. Not metaphorically, functionally. Powerful people spoke freely in front of servants the way they spoke freely in front of furniture. They negotiated, argued, flattered, and revealed themselves in rooms where she was present, because they had long since stopped registering her presence as the presence of a mind. That invisibility, which was designed as humiliation, was also information. An enormous, continuous, unguarded flow of information about how power actually operated. Not the formal version, not the public performance, but the real machinery underneath. She paid attention to all of it, not with the passive absorption of someone enduring their circumstances, but with the active, disciplined focus of someone who understood, at some level, that this education was the only one available to her, and she intended to use it. She noticed which arguments the master of the house always lost to his wife, and which ones he always won, and what the difference was between those two categories. She noticed which guests left the table feeling flattered, and which ones left feeling subtly diminished, and what the host had done differently in each case. She noticed the gap between what people said they valued and what they actually rewarded. That gap, she came to understand, was where everything important happened. What was it exactly that set her apart from the other women who moved through those same corridors and witnessed those same scenes? This is the question worth sitting with, because the scenes were available to everyone in the household. The information was not hidden, and yet she was the one who turned observation into a coherent map of how the world of power and influence actually worked. The difference was not in what she saw, it was in what she asked herself about what she saw. Every room she entered became a problem to be understood, not just a task to be completed. This is the transferable lesson, and it is worth being direct about it, because it is easy to hear a story like this and file it under remarkable individuals who were simply built differently. She was not built differently. She was trained by circumstances that forced a particular kind of discipline onto a mind that was willing to accept the training. You do not need a servant's invisibility to develop this skill, but you do need the willingness to enter rooms, any room, every room, as a student rather than a participant, to ask not just what is happening, but why, to watch what people do when they think no one consequential is watching. That is the curriculum she enrolled in by necessity. You can enroll in it by choice. The skill had a specific application that would eventually change everything for her. She understood, and this is the part that most people in her position never grasped, that powerful people are not primarily motivated by the things they say motivate them. They are motivated by the need to be understood, not agreed with, not flattered, though flattery can serve as a temporary substitute. Understood, seen clearly, taken seriously, recognized as more complex than the role they perform in public. A man who holds significant power in the world is surrounded by people who respond to the power, not to the person. That creates a particular loneliness that wealth and status cannot fill. She recognized this loneliness. She had lived a version of it her entire life. And so she did something that no one in her position was supposed to do. She engaged, not brazenly, not in ways that violated the explicit rules of her station, but in the small, precise moments where a word or a gesture could communicate something that no one else in the room had bothered to communicate. that she saw the person, not just the title, that she understood what was being carried, not just what was being displayed. It was a quiet revolution, conducted entirely within the existing rules, and it was more effective than any open defiance could have been. Open defiance could be dismissed. This could not. Here is the thing about developing a skill that the world has decided people like you are not supposed to have. The world is not prepared for it. Its defenses are built around the assumption that you will stay within the role assigned to you, that you will be what the room expects you to be. The moment you become something the room did not account for, the entire calculus shifts. She became something the room did not account for. And somewhere in a house where she had been given the servant's room, a man with a great deal to lose began to understand that the most interesting person under his roof was not sitting at his table. That realization, and what followed from it, is where this story takes its sharpest turn. He was not a revolutionary. That is the first thing you need to understand about him. He did not wake up one morning with a burning desire to challenge the social order or redeem someone the world had discarded. He was a man of his era, shaped by its assumptions, comfortable within its hierarchies, accustomed to the privileges that his name and his position quietly guaranteed. He had not spent a single day of his life in a room assigned to him by someone else, and yet he did something that his entire world told him was inadvisable, embarrassing, and beneath him. He saw her, really saw her, and then he acted on what he saw. The question worth asking is not whether his feelings were genuine. That debate belongs to biographers and romantics, and it tends to obscure the more interesting point. The more interesting point is this: what does it take for a person with everything to recognize the full humanity of a person with nothing? Because recognition of that kind is not automatic. It does not happen by accident. It requires a specific quality of attention, the willingness to look past the role a person has been assigned and ask what actually lives behind it. He had that quality. In a world that rewarded people for maintaining the correct distances, he refused the distance. That refusal cost him something real. The social consequences were not abstract. When a man of his standing chose to formalize a relationship with a woman of her station, the world around him had opinions, loud, sustained, and delivered through every channel available to a society that polices its own boundaries with the vigilance of a border guard. His peers questioned his judgment. His family expressed concern in the careful, devastating language that families use when they mean something much harsher than what they are willing to say directly. The institutions that conferred status in that era were built on the premise that certain lines did not get crossed, and the people who benefited from those institutions had a vested interest in enforcing that premise. He crossed the line anyway. Why? This is where the story becomes something more than a love story, and something more instructive than a fairy tale. He did not give her his name because he was naive about the cost. He did not act out of ignorance of the rules. He knew the rules better than most, because he had lived his entire life inside their protections. He acted because he had spent enough time in her presence to understand something that his world had collectively decided not to notice, that the hierarchy which placed her beneath him was not a reflection of any actual difference in their capacities. It was a fiction, a convenient, self-reinforcing fiction that served the people at the top and cost everyone else enormously. He had the rare honesty to admit that he could see the fiction for what it was. There is a specific kind of courage in that admission. It is not the dramatic courage of a battlefield or a public confrontation. It is the quieter, more uncomfortable courage of looking at the system that has benefited you and saying, out loud, that it is wrong, and then doing something about it, knowing full well what the doing will cost. Most people who reach that moment of clarity find a way to look away. The cost is too high, the comfort too established, the path of least resistance too well worn. He did not look away. He made a decision, and the decision was irreversible, and he made it with full knowledge of its weight. What he gave her was not only a name. A name was the legal instrument, the mechanism by which the world was forced to update its records and acknowledge a reality it would have preferred to ignore. But the name came with something larger and harder to quantify. It came with the public declaration that she was worth the cost, that the world's assessment of her had been wrong, that the room at the end of the hall had been an error of categorization, not a verdict on her value. In a society where a woman's worth was determined almost entirely by the man whose name she carried, he used that system, the very system that had diminished her, to reverse the diminishment. He did not dismantle the machinery, he redirected it. And she, for her part, was not passive in this. The portrait of the woman rescued by the man who loved her is a comfortable story, and comfortable stories tend to flatten the people inside them. She had spent years cultivating exactly the quality of presence that made her impossible to ignore. The intelligence, the attentiveness, the understanding of what powerful people needed that we examined in the last chapter. She had not been waiting to be saved. She had been building, with the only materials available to her, toward a position from which the world might finally be forced to deal with her on different terms. When he offered her his name, she was not receiving charity. She was completing a negotiation that she had been conducting, quietly and precisely, for a very long time. This is the part of the story that the world rarely tells, because it complicates the narrative in ways that are difficult to package. Two people, coming from opposite ends of the social order, each possessing something the other lacked, not in the sentimental sense, but in the strategic one. He had the name and the standing. She had the understanding of how the world actually worked beneath its formal surfaces. Together, they formed something the hierarchy had not anticipated and could not easily categorize. And the world, which had been so confident in its structure, found itself confronted with a new arrangement it had no ready script for. That confrontation, and what it produced, is where this story delivers its final answer. The room at the end of the hall still exists somewhere, in the architecture of a building that has long since changed its purpose, in the memory of walls that held the sound of a life being quietly, deliberately rebuilt. Rooms like that one outlast the people who slept in them. But here is the thing about this particular story. The name outlasted the room, the legacy outlasted the silence, and the woman who was handed a servant's quarter as a verdict on her worth ended up being the one that history found worth remembering. Legacy is a word we use carelessly. We attach it to monuments and titles, and the formal records that institutions keep of people they have decided matter. But the real measure of a legacy is simpler and harder than any of that. It is the question of whether your existence changed the conditions for the people who came after you, whether the walls moved, even slightly, because you pushed against them, whether the room at the end of the hall is a little less final for the next person who finds themselves standing in front of it. By that measure, what she left behind was not small. She did not write a manifesto. She did not lead a movement or deliver a speech that anyone recorded for posterity. The historical sources on her life are fragmentary in the way that the lives of women outside the formal record almost always are, glimpsed in the margins of documents written about someone else, inferred from the gaps between official accounts. And here is what makes that fascinating, rather than frustrating. The fragmentation is itself evidence of the system she defeated. The system was designed to make her invisible. The fact that her story survived anyway, in fragments, in the spaces between the lines, is proof that invisibility was not the last word. What she demonstrated, and this is the thesis that her life argues whether she intended it to or not, is that the rules of any given world are only as permanent as the collective willingness to enforce them. The hierarchy that assigned her to that narrow room was not a law of physics. It was a social agreement, maintained by the participation of everyone inside it. The moment someone refuses to participate, not violently, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, sustained refusal to accept the ceiling as a ceiling, the agreement starts to show its cracks. She found the cracks. She moved through them. And the world, which had been so confident in its architecture, had to do something it rarely does: revise. Now here is where this story turns and looks directly at you. Because this is not a history lesson. History lessons are comfortable. They happen at a safe distance, to people you will never meet, in circumstances you can tell yourself were exceptional. This is something else. This is a mirror. The specific details of her era are not your details. The laws are different. The customs have shifted. The explicit hierarchies of that world have been at least partially dismantled. But the underlying structure of the problem she solved is not historical. It is permanent. Every era has its version of the servant's room. Every era has its version of the verdict handed to people before they have had a chance to demonstrate what they are actually capable of. The question is what you do with the verdict. Most people negotiate with their ceiling. They push against it just enough to feel like they are trying, and then they find an accommodation, a story about why the ceiling is reasonable, or why this particular moment is not the right time, or why the people who broke through it had advantages that you do not. The accommodation is understandable. It is human. It is also the mechanism by which the room at the end of the hall perpetuates itself across generations. The ceiling does not need to be made of stone. It just needs you to stop pushing. She did not stop pushing. Not because she was fearless. Fear in her position was the rational response to a world that punished overreach with real consequences. Not because she was certain of the outcome. Certainty is a luxury that people at the bottom of a hierarchy are never granted in advance. She kept pushing because she had developed, through years of disciplined observation and the particular education that invisibility provides, an unshakable conviction about one thing: that the assessment was wrong, that the room was not a verdict. The distance between where she started and where she was capable of going was not fixed by birth or law or the consensus of people who had a vested interest in keeping her exactly where she was. That conviction is the thing worth inheriting from her story, not the specific circumstances, not the man who gave her his name, not the particular crack in the particular wall that she found in her particular era. The conviction, the decision to treat the world's assessment of your ceiling as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a fact to be accepted. She tested it. The test took years, cost real things, and required a quality of patience and precision that most people are never called upon to develop. But the result is what you are holding right now: a story that outlasted the room, a name that outlasted the silence, a life that proved, with the only evidence that ever truly convinces, that the starting position is not the ending position. It never was. The only question that remains is whether you are willing to act like you believe that.